What do we do when God calls us to leave everything behind and follow Him? Welcome back to another video brought to you by our friends at Peniel Press, where good theology is good discipleship. So, in a previous video, I talked about the need to be rooted in place, particularly in a mobile culture where we're tempted to try to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I also talked about how God made Eden as a place for Adam and Eve, not just space, and how He promised it to the patriarchs in the Bible that they would be restored to a place. And then when the people were brought out of Egypt, God brought them into the land and they were given plots of land where they could grow rooted as families and learn to love their neighbors and follow the Lord. I said there was a lot we could learn from God and how He rooted His people in the land and what that means for our discipleship. But didn't I forget something? Isn't it also true that God calls people to leave everything behind and follow Him? Well, this is true, and I hadn't forgotten it. The biblical picture of being rooted and uprooted is more complicated than we might want to imagine. So the land is good. God places people in the land, but just being in the same place forever is not always good. God consistently calls His people out of their lands to follow Him. So sometimes God uproots us before He plants us. So God promises Abram land and offspring. He tells them to look out across Canaan and behold the land that He will give to His descendants. They will be rooted in that land. They will have a place to learn how to love God and love their neighbor. They will have the blessing of being in God's country. But first, Abram must get up and go. Before Israel can be planted in Canaan, Abram must be uprooted from his homeland. Abram has a father, Terah. He had brothers, Nahor and Haran. Abram and Nahor, they both get married, and the whole family picks up and moves from Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur was one of the great cities of that day, and it sat at the mouth of the Euphrates River. It was a coastal city. It was powerful. It was a center of trade and culture. And the family heads hundreds of miles up the Euphrates River to a region that would be called Haran, probably after Terah's son Haran. In modern geography, Terah, Abram, and their family left southern Iraq, traveled all the way up to Turkey. And the thing is, they left, and yet Abram is called by God to leave. So the first move might have been economic. It might have been as a family decision. This is what's best for us as a family. This is why we've decided to do this. But Abram's next move, God calls him, go from your country, your people, and your father's house to the land I will show you. The Lord calls Abram to make a complete break with his past and his past identity. And some of us know what it feels like to leave our home country and go to a new one. Some of us have paid the cost of following Jesus when it cuts us off from our families. The call God issues to Abram is hard. Leaving the land of his birth will be painful. It may even feel a bit like betrayal. We might not have the same ties to the land in our highly mobile culture as our ancestors once did, but we can imagine what it was like for Abram to give up his country, his people, his father's household. He had relationships that defined who he was. He was Terah's son, and in that community, he was likely known by his relationship to his father and to his brothers. Who he was connected with who he belonged to, his people. And Abram has to leave all of that. And God doesn't even tell Abram where he's going. He has to make a complete break with his past without knowing anything about his future. He has to trust God who calls him. So this isn't just simply immigration from the old country to a land of opportunity, but it's blind trust in where God will lead him. And so we have Abram is called, and he goes. There's no hesitation in the text. And he's uprooted, and that leads him into two experiences that are very common for those who are uprooted and are called to follow in a sort of rootless life. but is a different kind of rootlessness than we find in our broader world. So there's vulnerability and there's conflict. So Abraham goes into Egypt after there's a famine in the land, and he is vulnerable. The king seeks after Sarah because she is beautiful. Now, Abram's plan was a mess, in my opinion. You can do your own research there. If you want me to go into more depth, let me know. But in the midst of this, God is at work. He protects Sarah, and she's not taken by the king. But Abraham is vulnerable. He's not a citizen. He can't appeal to the courts. And this is Pharaoh. Abram can't look for justice. He has no recourse. And again, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob live in and around the land that God will give them, but they live as vulnerable people. And this is true of all of us who are called to leave behind things to follow Jesus. That we enter into a form of vulnerability where we are facing threat. We face without always having recourse, without always having the ability to call for justice in this world. And the second thing tied with that is there's conflict. So God's people, when they step out of where they were into what God is calling them to go, where God is calling them to go, they face conflict. So Abraham's son Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob have increased conflict as people uprooted from the land. They've been called by God, and so they don't live as people of the land, even though they're in it. But Isaac gets into conflict over wells, and he's driven out again and again and facing these challenges in Gerar. And Jacob gets into conflict with his own family. Laban tricks him over and over. I think 10 times he changes his wages. Jacob's brother Esau tries to kill him. Being God's people is not a recipe for a peaceful life. Living as those who left behind the ways of the world for a life with God is to enter into conflict, to be at odds with the world. It's better, but it's often harder than living rooted in the old self, in the old ways of thinking. And the truth is that Christians know the fragility and vulnerability of rootlessness all too well. Leaving everything behind to follow God's call is not unique to Abram. Christians have crossed oceans, left families, left jobs, and entered the vulnerable life of sojourners to go where God leads them. Christians have left safety, security, and comfort behind for unknown lands, unknown futures, and unknown tasks because God called them. Like Abram before us, we have heard the voice of God calling us to get up and go, to leave behind even what is most precious to us, and go where God will show us. And at times our faith feels like stepping out over a chasm, trusting that God will place our feet on solid ground. And this experience of God's call continues in the life of the church. The desert fathers and mothers were called to leave cities to go into the wilderness. The North African Augustine leaves and lives in Rome and Milan. The Frenchman Calvin lives and serves in Geneva. The saints often live as foreigners in strange lands, because sometimes God uproots us before he plants us. And this Abrahamic rootlessness differs significantly from the rootlessness that's so prevalent in our culture, because Abraham steps out in faith, trusting in God's promise. He and his descendants will live without the security of stable homes, citizenship, or worldly belongings because they belong to God and have their eyes on his promise. They are people on a pilgrimage walking toward a country they cannot see. Maybe that's us today, too. So I hope this has been beneficial for you. If you're interested in learning more, I have a book, Rooted, Growing in Christ in a Rootless Age, which explores the biblical themes of rootedness, exile, and finding your home in Jesus Christ. So I'll put links for it in the description below, and God bless you, and I hope that I see you next time.